Thank you, Brad. Certainly appreciate each and every one of you joining into the song service. Appreciate that you're here this evening. For those that are visiting with us, we want you to know how much we appreciate you being here, and we encourage you to come back and worship with us any and every opportunity you might have. Turn to Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21. 2 points are made in this chapter. 2. That's it. The first 4 verses deal with Christ as he is watching the treasury and watches the widow put in the 2 mites and the sacrifice that she has to make in regards to doing that. Even though it was a small amount of money, it was everything that she had. So in comparison to what we do today, is that what we do? Also, starting then in verse 5 and going through the rest of the chapter, you're going to read about the destruction of Jerusalem. I'm putting this out here first because when we start in verse 5, I want you to get that in your mind, that these verses talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, because there's a couple of passages that are going to throw you for a loop if you don't understand what you're talking about, if you don't understand that Christ is not changing subject matters. And because of that, there have been some false doctrines that have been taught, and we'll just address one when we get down to about verse 27. But let's start in verse 1. He looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, "Truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, and she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had." And I guess if you read the entire Bible, this is probably the number one illustration that's always given in regards to giving, the attitude that you should have. Not that you should give everything. God doesn't expect us to give everything. He expects us to be liberal givers and cheerful givers, and that's what he expects. But this woman gives an illustration in regards to the proper way to give. So as we look at that, sometimes we need to look in the mirror and see if that's what we are imitating. Then starting in verse 5, then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, and he said, and by the way, I believe it is Matthew and Mark in their account between verses 4 and 5 says Christ leaves the temple. In verses 1 through 4, he is sitting in the temple, probably in the women's court. That's where the treasury seemed to be. And some say that upwards to 13 different containers were placed in the women's court where they could put their donations. That's just a tidbit of Old Testament history. But Christ, between 4 and 5, leaves the temple. But yet, some are going to come to him and ask the question, and they're going to bring up the fact of the temple and how it's beautiful and the stoneworks and all these things. Here's a phrase in verse 6 that you need to circle. And you need to circle this every time you see it in the rest of this chapter. These things. Would you turn me down just a little bit? I'm getting a little bit of feedback. These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. What's he talking about? He's talking about the destruction of the temple. coinciding with the destruction of the temple, it's also the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. Also coinciding with the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, is also the destruction, the ending of Judaism as they knew it. It's not going to be governed, they're not going to be governed by Judaism anymore. The records, we are told, were destroyed, and no one can lay claim to the fact that they can trace their ancestry back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, any of those individuals. So Judaism is destroyed as well. But circle the term, these things which you see. The days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. So they ask him, saying, Teacher, but when will these things, there it is, when will these things be? And the sign will be when these things are about to take place. When and signs about these things. What are these things? AD 70, destruction of Jerusalem, temple, Judaism. Nothing more. There's no implication of anything else. And he said, take heed that you be not deceived. Now, here's where deceivers play, even if you go back to Matthew chapter, is it 24 or 25? Excuse me one second, we'll look. It's Matthew chapter 24. Because in Matthew 24 and in verse 3, there are two basic questions that are asked. When will these things be? Same these things. When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming? Now, Christ answers those questions in Matthew 24 just exactly the way they're asked. Luke, for some reason, does not tell us about your coming. He's specifically pointing out one thing and one thing alone. When is this going to take place? And tell me about the signs that are going to conjoin with these things. Don't be deceived. Now, all you have to do today is turn on the radio or turn on television and listen to a denominational preacher, and one of the first things that's going to come out of their mouth is, oh, end time signs. What do they mean? Well, they're talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ. And they're saying that there are signs in relationship to the second coming of Christ. Listen what he says. Don't be deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is drawn near, therefore do not go after them. Anybody saying the time's at hand right now? You ever hear anybody on the radio say, woo, Jesus coming's near, it's got to be near. Why? Climate change. The walls in Russia have been torn down. China's rising up. Well, now, wait a second. He said, tell me about these things. What are these things? AD 70, destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, destruction of Judaism. These things. He said, don't let somebody confuse you. Don't let somebody come along and deceive you. Because I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about these things. And he said, you're going to hear all kind of rumors. Look at verse 9. You're going to hear of wars. You're going to hear of commotions. Do not be terrified. For these things, must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately. And the end there has reference to national Israel, the teaching of Judaism as a whole. That era is not going to come immediately. There's going to have to be some things that are going to happen. And then he said to them, nations will rise against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms. And there'll be great earthquakes in various places and famines and pestilence. And there'll be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. But before all these things, what do nations rising against nations and kingdoms rising against kingdoms and earthquakes and famines and pestilence and climate change and Russia and China and all the other commotions that you hear out here have to do with this? Not one thing. Not one thing. He said, I'm talking about what's going to happen in the destruction of Jerusalem. Before all these things, they'll lay their hands on you and persecute you and deliver you in the synagogues and prisons, and you'll be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. But it'll turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle it in your hearts, not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I'll give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. It's a little bit interesting. If you'd have been in my class back here in the auditorium this morning, we're starting 1 Corinthians and looking at some of those things. And we looked at the miraculous endowments that Paul gave the church at Corinth, utterances and knowledge. And as you tie all of these things together, and you see that these things are going to come to an end, but not before this is accomplished, it kindly puts everything coming to a head at about AD 70. You will be betrayed even by your parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you'll be hated for all my name's sake, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience possess your souls. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, now, hadn't changed subject, has it? All of this is going to transpire. All this is going to take place. The destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, Judaism, all going to fall in AD 70. All of the rumors that you've heard about, everything that's transpiring, going to take place in AD 70. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Now here's something you can understand. You know, lest I confuse the kids, and I won't do this to them, but you need to go back to Matthew 24 and read what he has to say in regards to the Roman armies and the fact that you're going to see them coming, and this is the time to get out of Jerusalem and head for the mountains of Judea, or you're going to die. You're going to be destroyed. Look here in verse 21. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. Now, I know this isn't talking about the end of time, because what difference does it make if I run to the mountains when the Lord comes back the second time and the earth is going to be destroyed and we're going to stand before God on judgment? Can I run to the caves in the Judean mountains and hide from God and be real quiet and God won't ever know I'm in there? And I can just get away with it. Oh, no. No. Every eye's going to see. Every knee's going to bow. Everybody's going to stand before God and give an account of their life. Everybody. That's me, that's you, and that's everybody we know. Verse 22, for these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to you who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Now, you can put those days and connect it back to these things. It'd be a terrible thing to be healthy as a horse and in best shape that you can possibly be in, and an invading army quickly surrounding the city of Jerusalem, about to destroy everybody that's in there. And if you could just run as hard as you could run, maybe you'd get on a horse and get away. But think about these poor ladies who are pregnant. Thinking about a lady that's carrying a baby. They're not going to want to leave those babies. They're not going to want to have to face such a stressful time as this. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And there will be signs in the moon, stars, sun, moon, stars, on the earth, distress of nation with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things. Now, those things go right directly back to these things. Those things go right directly back to those days. What days are we talking about? It's talking about when the Roman army is on the gates of Jerusalem and you can see them and you know they're there and you know you're about to die. When did that happen? A.D. 70. A.D. 70. Men's heart failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. For the power of heaven will be shaken. Now, I think if I had been dividing the verses, that phrase needs to go with verse 27. Verse 27 should read, for the powers of heaven will be shaken, then will they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Why do I say that? I say that because of the false doctrine that is known as the AD 70 theory. And the AD 70 theory says, and by the way, it was Max King who is given credit for teaching this and spreading this false doctrine, and it is still spread today, and it's in our neighborhood, so you better be aware of this. That Christ's second coming occurred in AD 70, and that we are now living in our heaven and hell here on earth. And that's it, folks. Now, that doctrine is wrong in so many ways. Why do I say the power of heavens will be shaken, then shall they see the Son of Man? Why do I say that phrase needs to go together? Because you can turn to passages in Isaiah, some in Matthew and some in Mark as well, that uses this expression about the Son of God coming in a cloud or on a cloud. And it has direct reference to the power of heaven is what it's talking about. Now, this is not a prophecy of the second kingdom of Jesus Christ occurring in these days. But what it is an illustration of the power of God, what is going to take place. He said there's going to be a parallel drawn between what's going to happen to those folks in Jerusalem who have not listened to my word, who have not heeded my warning, and they're going to be as he said, they're going to face the edge of the sword. They're going to be led away captive. They're going to be trampled underfoot. So the illustration is being used to show that as Jerusalem was subject to punishment by God, that's the same thing that's going to occur when the Son of Man comes from heaven for the second time. Now, I have plans in about 4 or 5 weeks to deal and dive in a whole lot deeper in this Max King theory, because as I said, it's being taught right here in our neighborhood. And you need to be aware of what's being taught so that you can be forewarned and forearmed and prepared to enter into a discussion with somebody who might say, well, Jesus Christ came in AD 70, and that was the second coming, and we're now living in our heaven or hell here on earth. I don't believe that, not one iota. Don't take this out of the context in relationship to what's being said. What's being said is, here's an illustration. God punishes those that are wicked. Did he do it in Jerusalem? Is he going to do it when the Son of Man comes for the second time? Absolutely. Absolutely. Now look at verse 28. Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. You better be aware. Look up, be ready. Then he spoke to them in a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. And when they were already budding, you see and know for yourself that summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Know that God's judgment, God's rule, everything that God has offered, it's at hand. It's near. Assuredly, I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass away until all things take place. Now, let me tell you something. If the destruction of Jerusalem's not what's being talked about, we got some old folks walking around here. They're at least 2,000 years old. Do you know any of them? I don't know anybody that meets that criteria. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will no means pass away. But take heed to yourself. Now, verses 34 and through 38 may be, let's just say it's the conclusion that he's drawing in relationship to the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, what can I do in relationship to the second coming of Christ? Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 tells us to watch and to be ready. Listen to what he says. Take heed to yourself, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things. Do you know what Josephus says in his, didn't he write the Antiquities, in his Jewish history? And in his Jewish history, he records that not a Christian died in the destruction of Jerusalem. Why not? Because he said, you can see it coming, and if you got good sense, you'll get out of Dodge. You'll get out of Jerusalem. But just as surely as there were those who did not heed God's warning in the day of the destruction of Jerusalem, there are those today that will not heed the warning that God says. And a similar fate is going to befall us. But in my estimation, even a worse fate, in that we're going to be separated from God throughout all eternity and spend an eternity in punishment in a devil's hell. Watch, therefore, and pray always that you be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and stand before the Son of Man. And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and stayed on the mountain called Olivet. Then early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. Christ utilized these opportunities to teach and to forewarn. You know, if I'm any kind of a preacher, that's a lesson for me. I ought to utilize these times to forewarn people of the coming of Jesus Christ. Not that there are any signs. I was reading the debate between Max King and Brother Nichols, and he used an illustration, or he used a phrase that when I saw it, I said, I have never heard that before in my life. And he talked about end-time signs. I've never heard a faithful gospel preacher talk about end-time signs. There are no signs of the second coming of Jesus Christ. There are none. Now, the illustrations that God gives us, he's going to come as a thief in the night. What does that mean? Silent, creep up on you, catch you when you're gone, catch you when you're unaware. A thief don't usually call and say, hey, Paul, I'm coming over to your house tonight, rob it. Would you please be gone? If they made that phone call, what would you do? You'd turn right around and say, hey, police, help. They're coming. He's coming as a thief in the night. Jesus Christ himself said in regards to the second coming, his second coming, no man knows. Look at Matthew chapter 24, and I believe it's verse 39. But of that day and that hour knoweth who? No man. No man. Well, what's my responsibility? To warn you, to encourage you to prepare your life and be ready, because Christ is coming again. And when he comes, if you're not ready, it'll be too late. If you're here this evening and never been obedient to the gospel of Jesus Christ, you can, through your faith, repentance, confession, and baptism, become a child of God. If you've done these things but yet you've fallen short, going back into the ways of the world, we encourage you to come as together we stand and sing.